Many of the afflicted are confronted with the crippling inability to exercise the human faculties of reason and the will. This leaves the Lyme victim with few choices but emotional reactions to the feeling of being trapped and an incomprehensible inability to help themselves. Despite numerous attempts by concerned friends, family members, and doctors, the Lymer seems bent on their own self-destruction. Determined to find ways to deny help, they seem to consistently subvert their own and others' attempts to assist in any way. A stubborn, tenacious part of the will takes over and turns against the Lyme victim until they are completely unable to fend for themselves. The will all but appears to turn against the individual, rendering themselves helpless against the onslaught of the disease, leaving them at the mercy of crippling effects on the brain, nervous system, and heart. Even though the Lymer can see the train wreck coming, they artfully dodge any attempt to derail the process. By this time, the disease itself has taken over, seizing the mind hostage in an inevitable final decline into a living hell. For those who must stand by and witness this descent, it is also very painful, for their best wishes and admonishments are systematically ignored or dismissed, sometimes violently, by the Lymer. Even as more symptoms arrive and conditions worsen, this seems to further fortify the will against itself in a downward spiral of self-destruction. It is most unfortunate that it takes coming to this point before the Lymer seeks help, when they are so far down in the mouth of the beast that their calls for help are stifled or ignored. Friends and family have possibly given up, and when their journey back seems most unlikely. As any predator is aware of how fear can cause paralysis, the Lyme spirochete, though invisible to the eye, becomes a monster of proportions that would make it a Goliath. Like a spider, which is the genus of the tick, it casts its web, snares its victim, and then slowly poisons its prey to helplessness. This poisoning of the will and reason is the diabolical side of Lyme, a slow and gradual process of giving up and giving in to forces seemingly beyond the control of its victim, even despite when help is at the doorstep. The condition uses despair to its advantage in rendering the victim hopeless and despondent, seemingly unable or unwilling to defend itself. It impersonalizes the self and often manifests psychiatric conditions of personality disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, etc. Its effects on behavior and character can be dramatic, sometimes changing the character of personality of its victim into wholly other beings. "He's not the same anymore" is a frequent assessment of loved ones who stand by, seemingly unable to do anything to stop it. Despite the imploring of the caretaker, the Lymer refuses treatment or doing anything that would alter or reverse the progress of the disease, having given up any thought or hope of recovery. This resignation forms the surrender of the victim to the predator and what we are describing as diabolical. Its effects and consequences of refusing treatment are seen in the decline of the spirit. It is no wonder the Lyme victim lapses into despair and depression. Often everything obtained is lost, most of all the ability to do even simple things. Unable to work or contribute is difficult beyond measure, especially for givers who now must be receivers. Absent are the friends who we used to enjoy doing things together, and often even those closest to us, our family members, refuse to acknowledge Lyme as a possibility for what appears to them as being lackadaisical, a loafer, hypochondriac, or malingerer. Profound is the effect on those who, of no fault of their own, cannot defend themselves against these onslaughts. The loss of physical and mental strength is reflected deeply in the spirit, which suffers if not equal to the body, perhaps greater. Compound this with departure of friends and acquaintances with whom one no longer interacts with, as one might come to evolve with stroke victims. The effects are similar. The loss of hope is all too familiar with those who have been robbed of so much and have so little to look forward to. Why do these conditions persist, even though we know how they are produced? It is perplexing that those who need help the most are so defiant in their efforts to refuse it. Then comes the affixing of blame. Do those who suffer deserve their fate? As ridiculous as this sounds, it seems that the source of the real affliction is self-driven, a form of self-punishment that must be endured without interference by others. The indifference the Lyme victim shows towards their own well-being could be observed as some kind of self-deprecation, and the onlooker must ask whether there is something to this. Fear, realized by the Lyme victim, is an insidious form of paralysis that renders the will unable to act. As the onset of the disease attacks the neocortex, thinking and emotional processes become increasingly impaired, giving rise to irrational behavior, impulsive reactions, and poor judgment. Under a blanket of hopelessness, victims resign themselves to what seems to be the inevitable fate of complete shutdown. Often this is seen in the parade of chronic illnesses of which Lyme is the source, the great initiator, not the great imitator, as we have been led to believe. All too frequently, misdiagnosis of mental illness traps its victim in the web of the well-meaning physician, the psychologist or the psychiatrist, or in the office of the neurologist, rheumatologist, etc. These well-meaning doctors are also victims of the spiritual dilemma, caught up in the money and narrow focus on treating symptoms only, regardless of causes. Emphasis on the treatment of symptoms, while ignoring causes, pushes the spiritual dilemma further up the pyramid, where professors of medical schools and universities are taught and pass down the same doctrine: ignore the causes and treat the symptoms. The entire medical community begins to emerge as an upside-down and backward method of suppression that Lyme presents to its victim. It begins to appear that the entire system stacked against the individual sufferer consists of the entire healthcare system, family, and friends, comprising the net worth of the entire support structure that the patient so desperately needs. It is evident that there is something essentially diabolical about the nature of this illness. It cleverly cloaks something amiss, a systematic undercurrent of subversion, deception, suppression, and oppression of its victims. A curse of monstrous proportions. It squelches any attempt to expose the truth about its actual nature, a ruthless predator in endless pursuit of new victims. The predatory nature of this disease is a reflection of something that exposes a larger truth. What appears to be an independent, cunning force, controlled and manipulated by dark intentions, with its own primitive consciousness and cunning intelligence, driven only by the impulse to secure for itself its own survival, and always at the high cost and sacrifice of its victims. All seems to be at its mercy. Researchers, doctors, the media, and patients alike. What appears to be an evil external presence, is this possibly a manifestation of our own consciousness, a grinning demon behind the curtain of our own subconscious? As ludicrous as this sounds, there is yet to be a better explanation for the twisted intent that seems to accompany everything about this insidious disease. Its primitive yet powerful intelligence is relentless and unmerciful, like an evil genie programmed for one purpose: to survive at all costs, even if it costs everything in the attempt. I'm stating here that Lyme disease is a systemic affliction of the human spirit, a mental illness of the collective human consciousness. We as a human social society have strayed far, have ignored the signs, and are wandering in the wilderness of spiritual desolation, where predators lurk and thrive on the negative thoughts and emotions evoked and sustained by it. It is a vicious cycle, difficult to ascertain, and even more difficult to break. And it is not the extent of the spiritual affliction. The affliction is larger than just Lyme. It is manifest in all of our perceptions of the external world. We see it reflected in our daily lives, in the constant violence to our own kind, greed, fear, hatred. These behaviors cannot persist without its consequences. What is evidently emerging is the cure we so desperately seek in the external world. Antibiotics, vaccines, diet will do little to stem the rising tide in the wake of misery that follows. I'm suggesting that the answers and solutions we seek to the real causes and cures are to be found within ourselves, which are reflected in the external world at large, accumulated as manifestations of our collective human consciousness. Therein is the real source of both the cause and the cure. The permanent solution to this problem will not be found in the world of medicine, politics, and science, but in the recognition of its actual source, us. There we may find what we are really looking for, the origin and cause of our own affliction, brought on to us, and ultimately resolved in the end by us. Lyme disease is a manifestation of an affliction of the human spirit. Until we recognize and acknowledge this, we will continue to be the source of our own gradual descent and demise in the physical world of Lyme disease. When we turn inwards, therein the light of hope can be found and the path to well-being.